Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to unpack the sources you sent over, trying to find those aha moments in what's happening globally.
Yeah, looking at everything from, geopolitics to climate, social stuff.
Exactly. The mission, as always, is to connect those dots, pull out the key insights, and, well, hopefully leave you feeling a bit more informed about it all.
Precisely. It's about seeing maybe the bigger picture, the currents underneath the daily news flow, and why it genuinely matters to understand them.
Okay, so let's get into it. The sources kick off with some pretty significant geopolitical moves, specifically this escalating conflict between Israel and Iran.
Right. We saw that on June 13th, Israel launched what they called Operation Rising Lion.
Over 100 targets inside Iran. That sounds major.
It really was. Reports mentioned nuclear and military sites, key IRGC commanders, even scientists were apparently targeted.
And what's the real significance here, beyond just the attack itself?
Well, the key thing is how it signals a shift. For years it's been mostly proxy warfare, indirect conflict.
Mm.
This feels like a move towards direct state-on-state military confrontation. And hitting those specific IRGC commanders, that's striking at the core leadership.
So challenging them directly. And Iran responded.
They did. With Operation True Promise the Third, hundreds of missiles and drones fired back at Israel. It's really changing the old rules of deterrence in the region. We haven't quite seen this kind of direct back and forth in decades.
That does sound like a profound change. So beyond the immediate military actions, what are the sort of longer-term worries you're seeing? For stability, I mean.
That's the critical question, isn't it? How do you actually de-escalate when direct attacks become, well, almost normalized?
Right.
You saw the global reaction. Immediately, diplomatic alarms, calls for restraint. There's this real fear that the old boundaries are being crossed.
Pushing things closer to a wider conflict.
Exactly. A wider regional war that could spiral and, have huge global consequences, especially for things like oil markets.
And speaking of those wider impacts, the sources then shift gears quite dramatically to the environment. And it's quite a stark picture.
Yeah, NASA's latest data, it's showing this alarming increase in both intense droughts and intense floods.
Almost doubling the historic rates, I think it said.
That's right. And they've got this term for it, hydroclimatic whiplash.
Hydroclimatic whiplash. Okay. So it's not just extreme weather, it's the speed.
It's the speed and the swing, rapidly going from severe drought to major flood in a really short space of time.
Which must make planning incredibly difficult.
Almost impossible with traditional methods. Climate adaptation strategies just aren't built for that kind of rapid oscillation. And the scary part is scientists are saying communities, infrastructure are just not ready for this level of change, this speed.
So our models are struggling to keep up.
Even the advanced ones, yeah. It's forcing a complete rethink about how we build things, how we prepare for emergencies globally.
So if the old ways aren't working, what are the new ideas? What are scientists pushing for beyond just, standard disaster prep?
The focus is shifting towards what they call dynamic resilience.
Dynamic resilience.
Yeah, so not just preparing for a flood or a drought, but preparing for the constant switching between them.
Okay, so more flexibility.
Exactly. Flexible water systems, better early warning networks using real-time data, community planning that can pivot quickly when conditions change drastically. It's adapting to, well, constant unpredictability, really.
Adapting to unpredictability. That sounds like a theme. And we're seeing other kinds of unpredictability too, right? Socially, economically.
Definitely. Look at Europe. We're seeing residents in cities like Barcelona, Lisbon, Venice, staging these quite direct protests against overtourism.
Well, water pistol protests. I saw something about that.
Yeah, visually striking. It's highlighting things like rising housing costs, the strain on infrastructure, basically a loud call for stricter limits on tourism. You can really sense the local frustration boiling over.
And this isn't just happening in Europe, this kind of pushback.
No, it connects to broader trends. Economically, for instance, OPEC just put out a report. They're forecasting steady global economic growth into late 2025, which sounds okay. But importantly, they slightly lowered their estimates for non-OPEC oil supply in 2026.
Okay, subtle, but potentially significant.
It suggests a potential tightening of global supply down the line, kind of irrespective of the immediate geopolitics, which could mean more price volatility later.
And with oil already around $80 a barrel, partly because of the Middle East stuff.
Yeah, it shows how even positive growth forecasts are vulnerable to these geopolitical shocks. It's all interconnected.
And that sense of local frustration, people demanding change, it's popping up elsewhere too. The sources mention LA and Nepal.
That's right. In Los Angeles, you had anti-ICP protests over mass deportations turning violent, needed the National Guard, a curfew, pretty serious stuff.
Okay.
And then completely differently, in Kathmandu, Nepal, huge crowds were demonstrating for the return of the monarchy.
Wow, very different causes.
Totally different triggers immigration policy versus national identity. But both are these powerful public demands for really fundamental shifts or even restorations. It points to some deep cracks, maybe, in different societies.
You know, when you lay it all out like that, it really is striking how these different threads, the international conflicts, the climate extremes, the local unrest, seem to flow together.
They really do. And what stands out is how these distinct pressures, whether it's state conflict, environmental chaos, citizen protests, or economic shifts, they're all contributing to this shared feeling of volatility.
Across very different places.
Yeah, it highlights just how integrated, but also how fragile our global system kind of is. You know, a ripple in one area can easily become a wave somewhere else entirely.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with maybe a final thought to chew on. Given everything we've just unpacked, this Israel-Iran escalation, the hydrochromatic whiplash, the pushback against tourism in Europe, OPEC's outlook, those diverse protests from LA to Nepal, what underlying common threads do you see running through all these different challenges? Something to think about.